Awesome. Cool. Well, it seems like we have a few hundred people join, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'll kick it off to Joey, but nice to have everyone here.
Yeah, I'm excited. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Just, of course, want to say hope you and yours are well. If this is your first time joining us, thank you. And yeah, as I mentioned, I'm Joey, and I'm a design advocate over at Figma. We also have Ozra on the line, who is also at Figma. She's waving. So if you've tuned into our past webinars, welcome back. Always good to see familiar faces. And like I said, glad to have you here. Say hey, introduce yourself in chat. Let us know where you're at. Before we actually get into it today, I just want to give a little bit more context about how these came about. Our goal with these webinars is just to bring everyone closer right now and, to bring people into the files that we're working on. And today we have two amazing hosts who are going to kind of walk us through. So yeah, just really excited. And I also just want to say, as I mentioned, feel free to use chat to introduce yourselves, and then the Q&A feature to ask questions. We're definitely going to be moderating for those, and we will ask the hosts either when appropriate after their talk or towards the end. As I said, I'll be monitoring it. And lastly, if you're sitting there with any topic in mind or things that you'd like to hear more about as it pertains to Figma, definitely let us know. Feel free to share with myself on Twitter, Joey A. Banks, or at Figma, just our general account. We would definitely love to collect that feedback, and we just want to make sure these are as useful and as productive for everyone as we can. We hope to do these once a week, so if you want to subscribe or kind of check out for future events, that's over at figma.com/events. I also finally want to just mention that this is being recorded, and all of the decks and assets and stream will be shared out afterwards, so definitely stay tuned for that. But with that, let's get started. I want to introduce, and I'll let them say a little bit more about themselves, but I want to introduce both Silvia and Helena, and they're product designers at Stash and Coda. Yeah, so I'm really glad to have you here today, and I'm really excited for you to walk us through working with developers in Figma. And with that, I'll turn it over. Helena, do you want to go first? Sorry, awkward pause there.
Okay, yes. Hi.
These are all new for us.
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. Okay, so yeah, I'm Helena. I'm a product designer from Ecuador. I'm assuming you can see my screen. Yeah, I've been designing software for the past 6 years at places like Google, TransferWise, Khan Academy, in different parts of the world. And I'm currently at Coda, where we're building a new kind of doc that kind of combines word processing, spreadsheets, and app-like capabilities. So you can do things like take notes, but you can also do things like create your own processes and workflows. Okay, so I think I'm just gonna jump right in. Yeah, so obviously we're here today to talk a little bit about how to better collaborate with your engineers. And in particular, I wanted to talk about how to collaborate with your engineers early on in the design process. So in the past, I've had some hesitations about collaborating with engineers super early on. I've said things like, I need time and space to create, I'm like a creative, or, if I share this mock, then they're going to build it right away. And I don't want us to like get focused on a solution right away. But, as I've kind of continued doing this, I've really learned how to work better with engineers so that I can understand my constraints a lot faster, and then build more thoughtful solutions because of that. And in particular, during this kind of ideation part of the design process, that's where I find it particularly important, because that is the time when you're trying to understand your constraints, when you're trying to come up with all of these ideas. Yeah, and then engineers are obviously really great at this part because they have so much technical knowledge that they can help to guide you in those constraints. And they're really great at pointing out edge cases. And so when you have all of those edge cases right away, then you can build those more thoughtful solutions. Okay, so yeah, so how do you actually go about doing that? And to kind of help illustrate some of the points that I'm going to be talking through, I'll walk through one of the features that we built last year at Coda called Packs Tables. Everybody at Coda gets these little characters. It's me, it's my engineering partner, Gil. So yeah, that's kind of who the team was. We had a broader engineering team, but it's helpful to have kind of one engineering partner who's going to be there with you throughout the whole thing to really work together and brainstorm. And the feature we were building, Packs Tables, was this feature, and is this feature that you can pull in data from apps like Spotify, Google Calendar, Gmail directly into a Coda doc. So this is a Coda doc here, and what you're seeing is a table full of my playlists from Spotify. So you connect an account and then you pull in data from there. So it can be like my playlist from Spotify, my calendar events, and so on and so forth. So with a feature like this, it was very technical because we were working with APIs from different apps. And so we had to come up with a solution that was going to work across all of these different apps. Okay, so I'm going to talk through 3 things that we did to actually collaborate and come to a solution for this Packs Tables that we were building from scratch. All right, so the very first thing I did was start creating these strawman mocks. And so you may have heard of a strawman proposal, and that's essentially like a write-up, you know, like a written brief that is used to generate discussion and to ask questions. And so strawman mocks are kind of like the visual equivalent of that. So they can be super simple and they can be fairly uninformed. And the idea is that they should be like very quick to make. So you don't want to spend a ton of time on them because oftentimes your ideas at this point, you'll have a lot of misconceptions. A lot of things will be wrong, and that's totally okay. So you don't want to spend too much time on that. They should ask more questions than they offer solutions. So that really is the purpose of them. And to that end, they should also show a lot of variety. So make sure that you're showing a lot of options rather than kind of narrowing in on a single thing. So I'll kind of quickly show my Figma file here. When we were starting to build Packs Tables, this is a Figma file for the whole thing. But as you can see here, these are kind of like my options 0. And these are what I would kind of call strawman mocks in terms of they were about getting out some of these key questions that I had from the very beginning. So you can, other ways to think about this are kind of like a brain dump of your assumptions. Or you can also think about it like, you know, what would it look like if it were easy? Like, how would it just work? And so, you know, these are different questions that I had about it. And if you looked at these mocks carefully, they're not very fleshed out. They're quite rough. You know, these are using some of our core components, so I'm not making new components at this point. But the idea is that you're just showing some concepts, and they should just be detailed enough to illustrate the concept, and that's about it. And as you're walking through these mocks with your engineer, definitely be proactive about asking, like, what are your biggest misconceptions here? What are like big things that you're missing that you haven't thought about quite yet? What's an interesting direction? And what are difficult directions that we might take? And that's not to avoid those difficult directions, but when you're talking to your engineering team in particular, it's really helpful to know what they consider difficult so that you can understand those trade-offs. Okay, cool. So it's still early in the design process. So while you've brought your kind of strawman mocks to the table and you've brought out your own assumptions, it's still super helpful to come up with new ideas and help visualize those. So with your engineering partner, you can visualize new ideas together. So as designers, obviously we have this like pretty cool like skill of being able to bring ideas and questions to life. And we do that sometimes for our own ideas, but it's super helpful to do that for your teammates as well, especially early on in this collaboration process. So yeah, some things that you might want to do are like creating a wireframing kit. At Coda, we have, you know, all of our components already ready to go. And so we actually design in hi-fi quite a bit unless we're designing something completely new. And, you know, nowadays in this remote world, you can, you know, just use a pen and paper, point your camera to it, or if you have an iPad, that's really nice to screen share as well. Back when Gail and I were working on PAX tables, we would just get into a room and do some whiteboarding, and then get pretty specific about what questions we had, and then, you know, draw up some kind of UI for it. And the idea here is not to design the UI. The idea is to make sure that we're on the same page about what problems and questions we're discussing. And the pictures just help to make sure that we're being very specific about what that is. Okay. Which brings me kind of to the last thing that we did, which was defining our key questions. So key questions are the big questions that are going to help to answer all of the little questions down the line. So you can kind of think about them as principles. And essentially, they're going to help you make sure that you're tackling the problem in the right order. They will help you make decisions faster also, and they make sure that you're not debating solutions from the beginning. So a non-product example for what a key question might be is, let's say that you're planning an event and somebody asks, or you ask, like, should I get custom napkins? Prior to deciding whether you should get custom napkins or not, you should have thought about what's your budget, what are your time and resources, what's the feeling of the event. Those are kind of the key questions, which will then decide whether you should get custom napkins or not. So for PAX tables, this is a screenshot of the Coda doc that we used to keep track of some of our key questions. So as you can see, you know, there's a bunch of different questions and some very, very non-fleshed out options at the beginning. Later, we fleshed these out. Sometimes we had mocks for each of these options, and then eventually we would come to a decision about what was the right option for each one. And what Gil and I did is that we would kind of come up with these questions during our brainstorms, but then we'd get the whole engineering team on a call, the whole engineering team who was going to work on the project, because we had around 5 engineers working on this. And we'd run through each of the questions and the options. And the idea wasn't to like make a call on each of these questions right away, but it was to make sure that the team agreed that, oh, these are the most important questions to answer. It's also a really good time to engage your whole team, not just the main engineer that you've been working with. Cool. So those are kind of the things that we did. I definitely found in this project in particular, because it was so technical, that it helped us to make solutions faster, but also like much more thorough. And these were kind of the 3 things that we did. So I started by creating my strawman mock, so kind of my brain dump of all my assumptions, talking through those with Gil, my main kind of engineer, helping to visualize new ideas and questions that would come up, and then defining those key questions and bringing them to the rest of the team. Okay, thank you.
That was awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. That was super insightful, especially like as a designer who loves working with engineers, and just kind of hearing all that was really, really helpful. We had a couple of questions that came in, if you don't mind, maybe just asking 2 or 3. So the first one was just kind of wondering about, like, was a PM a part of the process along the way? Definitely engineers along the way, but like, did you, or when did you decide to also include PMs kind of in everything you described?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you know, I had my little like design phase doodle, and the very first part of the design phase should definitely be about like defining what the problem is. Like, is it a problem worth solving? Like, why are we going to tackle this problem? And for that project, that's really where I was working more closely with the PM. And throughout the process, the PM would come to those sessions where we would talk through the key questions and things like that. So yeah, the PM was involved along the way. I would say maybe more so at the beginning when we were doing kind of the problem definition. And because this was such a technical project, then it was really about getting like more into the weeds with my engineering colleagues.
I love that. That was seriously good slides. Another question that came in was just kind of wondering if you work in Agile over at Coda, or if not, what does that process look like?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, it's very collaborative kind of along the way. And so we're working in kind of sprints where each of the projects takes a few weeks, and we'll kind of go through the whole process during that time, and then collaborating along the way. And all of the designers are embedded into product teams with engineers and PMs.
And then I have a question regarding, so I thought that the idea of like the key questions is amazing, right? Especially right now where like context is more important than ever. You know, you could say with all of us being remote or many of us being remote. Do you have any advice on just kind of like coming up with those key questions and then kind of determining like a structure like for you and your team to decide, you know, what is the right answer for those key questions? Do you ever come back to them? Do you ever revisit? Or yeah, I'm just kind of curious to learn a little bit more about that. That was really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's definitely, you know, a back and forth. Actually, as I was sharing these slides with some of my teammates, they're like, well, you know, wouldn't it be great like if we always had the key questions up front rather than like this third step later on? And it's like, yes, that would be great, but it just doesn't really happen that way most of the time. Realistically, you need to have those conversations in order to really start getting at what those questions are. And I don't know if there's like a step-by-step of like, here's how you come up with those questions. It's really about when somebody is asking something or when you're debating a solution, making sure to take a step back and say, wait, is this the fundamental question that we need to ask right now? Like, or is there some high level question that relates to this? And that is just about taking that time to say, hey, like, actually, I think like if we knew the answer to this, then we would know the answer to this other thing. So it's a bit of a back and forth. And yeah, and then we definitely revisit those questions all of the time. And, you know, one of the ways that we try to think about these questions as well is like one-way doors or two-way doors. So some decisions are two-way doors in the sense that if you make this decision at this time, then later you can always kind of go back and change your mind and it's going to be okay. But a one-way door decision related to a key question is like, if we make this decision, like there's no going back, this is it. And a lot of those one-way door questions and decisions tend to be key questions.
That makes a lot of sense. I love that. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah,
maybe one last question. Oh, go ahead, Daza.
I'll chime in with a question.
Yeah.
People are curious, Helena, how do you deal with some of the conflicts that might arise between designers and engineers / PM, and who mediates some of those conversations?
Yeah, I mean, there's, yeah, all sorts of conflicts can arise, I suppose. I think like with PAX tables in particular, one of the main challenges that we had was because we were working across all of these different APIs, making a solution that was very general, but also UX friendly, which can be very difficult. And I think in that sense, that was definitely a trade-off of like, there were some, you know, engineering reasons why we would want to make something more general and some UX reasons why you might want to make things a little bit more specific. In that case, for example, in that particular challenge, it became super important for me to kind of get into the weeds about every app that we were going to build for and understand all of the API constraints so that I could then really highlight, okay, well, if we go specific here, this is what it could look like, but then we can abstract it in this way, if that makes any sense. So, you know, I think a lot of what it comes down to is making sure that you're understanding one another and helping to bridge those gaps either through pictures or through meetings or through questions. And so I would say in general, that's kind of how I approach that.
Awesome. Well, I have one more question. This is super important. How do I get one of those cartoons of myself?
So the characters that I showed, those are the Coda characters, and you can get one by making some docs for Coda. You can publish docs on Coda. That's another feature that I worked on. And to some makers who are really involved will make a character for them. So
awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. That's really awesome. Thanks, Helena.
Yeah, thank you.
I love that. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for just kind of answering those questions and walking through everything. And I know there were a lot of questions that came in. We'll be sharing those questions after the fact with both speakers and hopefully having their answers there. Yeah, just wanted to thank you again. That was really amazing. I want to introduce and kind of turn over to Silvia next. Super excited to have you from Stash and for you to share all of your slides and kind of walk through what the process with the, looks like for all of you there. So I will let you share your screen.
All right,
you got it.
Well, hello, everybody. Hope you're all healthy and relatively happy today. My name is Silvia Tueros-Cossio, and I'm a design manager at Stash. So weird times right now, but I'm so happy that Figma could bring us all together to talk about one of my favorite subjects, the designer-developer relationship. So I started my career about 10 years ago as a one-woman shop doing design and development. And now I work in agile environments on a cross-disciplinary team. I've worked on a lot of different teams in that time, and even though each one was unique and each one had their own processes, they've all followed the same sort of flow. So stuff happens before delivering designs, stuff happens while delivering designs, and then stuff happens after delivering designs. But we're going to start with the before delivery process. And I'm going to walk you all through some hard-earned tips at each stage of the process. So take the things that resonate with you and try it out with your team, and then keep the other ones in your back pocket to try later. You each have long careers ahead of you, and you'll never know when something will come in handy. So first things first, review early. You want to review early with developers so it doesn't feel like you're tossing something over the wall. A good gut check for this is how surprised they are when they see the designs in sprint planning. Ideally, they're not going to be surprised at all. So whether your team works in sprints or not, it's important to get into a good groove with your developers, and transparency is a huge part of that. So there's a lot of beautiful collaboration that happens between product and product design naturally, but without involving engineering, you're missing a whole leg of your tripod. And the more they're exposed to the project at an early stage, like Helena said too, the more invested they will be in making sure that what they deliver actually matches what you intended with the design. So what reviewing early could look like for your team. It could be DMs with a go-to engineer. Sometimes smaller questions are a lot easier to ask to one person than to a whole group. A dedicated day of the week to review designs with your team. A Slack channel dedicated just for reviews. What we use that's really effective is a Slack user group with just your front-end engineers, so you can ping them all at the same time. So moving on to number 2, have an FAQ ready to link to. So when we first transitioned to Figma, we had emails, pinned Slack messages, even company-wide tutorials on the basics of Figma. And the fact is, people learn in many different ways. And if you're at the beginning of using a new tool, you will 100% be asked the same question by multiple people. So by having an FAQ, you can have those tailored answers ready to go. And then they can even link to more in-depth documentation if you need it. So it doesn't have to be anything fancy. Ours lives in Confluence. Tip number 3, hook up your commenting to Slack. So depending on how many methods of communication your company has, you want to make sure that you're responding at the right speed. For us, most of our Figma comments require near immediate responses, especially now that my developers are commenting in there. So right now for organization level accounts, I'm sure people with organization accounts know Figma notifications don't come through Slack, they just come through email. So since I save email for slower response things, here's what I do to get my Figma comments in Slack. So first, enable the email Slack app. So here you will get an email address that when you send emails to it, it'll automatically post to a channel in Slack. 2, make a Gmail filter. So you can search for what you want to send to Slack. Mine looks complicated, but it's not. It's basically just saying to take all of the emails from Figma with the subject mentioned you in a comment. And then you can set this filter to forward to your new Slack email address. Then celebrate, you now have comments in your Slack. So your developers will be happy and you have one less thing to pay attention to in your inbox. So now let's focus on what happens when you deliver your designs to the team. So 1, this is very important, bring your PM into Figma. This is basically a guaranteed way to make your stories better. So assuming most of you here are going to deliver designs to your product manager so they can write stories and review with the team, getting your PMs familiar with Figma will make that process way easier. So get them familiar with directly linking to frames, with making new frames, and with managing comments. And what you're actually doing here is empowering your PM to accurately represent your designs when you're not in the room. And if you're using Jira, you're definitely going to want to install the Figma into Jira plugin. So before Figma, many of your PMs were probably in the habit of screenshotting parts of the flow for Jira. So for my team, not only would these screenshots quickly get outdated, especially if you have an amazing PM who likes to get ahead of the story writing and write them early, and they would also cause some confusion on the team if the designs were ever updated, and designs are usually updated. So this plugin basically lets you link any frame directly into your Jira ticket. Then right from the ticket, you can preview the design. No screenshot necessary. So other ways that this could look like for your team, you could hold a PM-focused Figma 101 session where they have a safe space to ask questions specific to their needs. Also, what's worked for us is to use the commenting to keep conversations contained to the Figma file as much as possible. So not only will it be much easier to wrangle feedback, but then they will get more comfortable using Figma with the whole team. So for example, if they're driving during a backlog grooming session and they need to review designs. So tip number 2, use components to help write user stories. So some of my teams have transitioned to using user stories as a way of breaking up work. So basically, user stories allow you to break down a project into stories where each one is delivering user value. The way this plays out in Jira is that instead of linking to individual screens, we'll link out to parts of the flow that address the user story. And this is where components come in handy. So if you make a screen in each screen in your main flow a component, then you can use instances to create as many flows as you need for other user stories. So what this looks like in practice, I'm going to show you all. All right, so here is your beautiful main flow. This happens to be our main flow for our new feature partitions. But say you wanted to make a flow just for setting reminders. So what you can do is, let's make this into frame. What you can do is make this into a component. Make this into a component. And then you can use instances of these to make all of the flows that you need. So this way, you're only making changes in the main flow, and then those changes propagate out into all of the other kind of other flows that you need. All right. Okay, moving on to tip number 3, use versioning. In a super regulated industry like finance, between our compliance team and partners we work with, there can be a number of different versions floating around with a number of different edits. So engineers face that challenge too, and they've already worked out a solution for it. It's versioning, not just final or final, but using actual version numbers. For my team, what that means is that we use V0 for initial explorations, and then we'll work our way up to V1, our MVP launch. So when we get to a version that has been compliance and stakeholder approved, that's when the page title actually gets a little emoji lock. So any other iterations outside of that get pushed to a new version. That way we can still capture new ideas just in an organized way. We also use these version numbers in Jira, so it's super, super clear what version we're working from. Another tip, use Figma to make supplemental documentation. You can use Figma itself as the single source of truth to clarify what you're building. And by doing this, you will prevent the need to open a million docs to make sense of one design. So what this could look like for your team, a table linking to different edge cases, links to Lottie files for animation, one example that came up for my team was this. So we had lots of screens in our main flow, but what the developers actually needed to make sense of this was a decision tree. So what I did in Figma was made this decision tree, but then at certain points in the decision tree, I could link out to certain frames. So I can just get the link for this. Then here, let's do that. And then this will automatically link to the frame that you need. All right, so let's dig into some tips for after you've delivered the designs. So first, try using Figma from your developer's perspective. So we save editor accounts for team members who design screens. So most of our developers have viewer accounts. And viewer accounts in Figma have a pretty different experience from editor accounts. And by knowing what those limitations are, you can get ahead of how to change your process for your developers. So here's what an editor view looks like. This should look pretty familiar to most of you here. And then here's what a viewer view looks like. So notice that the editing capabilities aren't there, and they also can't use any of the plugins that you've downloaded. In order to do that, they'd need to duplicate this, and then they could use plugins from drafts, but it's a kind of a hacky workaround. What I recommend is making a separate viewer account for yourself, sitting with an engineer, and walking through what they would typically need from a design. So for example, if they need to export assets at different sizes, teach them how to use the exporting panel. Better yet, make an FAQ for it, because if they have a question about it, some other engineer will have a question about it. And so you can just directly link them to that. If they need to export illustrations, teach them how to use the preview window so that when they export, they can make sure that they're exporting the right thing. But nothing replaces just listening to each other. Designers are natural problem solvers, and if you make sure to check in with your team about how things are working or not working, you will know how to help them. So tip number 2, iterate on your process. One example, we were using Jira tickets to document our mixed panel events, but through talking with the team, this was getting really confusing. And in an effort to move things into a single source of truth, we tried using Figma to document our mixed panel events. Worked like a charm. Everybody was happy. So this is to say that every team is different, and you're going to need to do different things to make it work. And being flexible with process and making sure that whatever you do works for your team will go a long way. So what this could look like. Definitely normalizing feedback so that your team can talk about when things aren't going well. Holding a specific design developer process retro, this has worked really well for us. And then also talking with other designers about what they've tried with their teams. Like I said, every team is different, so there might be a tip there that could help you. And that's it for me. So just a quick rundown of what we've covered. So for delivery, for before delivery, review early, start building out an FAQ, and get your Figma comments in Slack. And then for during delivery, it's really important to bring your PM into Figma, use components to help write user stories, use versioning, and use Figma to make supplemental documentation. Then for after delivery, try using Figma from the viewer's perspective, and don't be afraid to iterate on your process. So that's it for me. I love nerding out about process and design in general, so feel free to reach out to me on Twitter at SilviaTC if you want to talk more. That's
Silvia,
it.
that was so wonderful.
You, Joey. Yeah, thank you.
That was so great, both of you. Thank you so much. That was awesome. I do just want to say to everyone, we will be sharing these slides out after, but yeah, would love to ask a couple of questions just kind of about the presentation and about work over at Stash. So first, I love the idea of like the tripod. I think that's super clever, and it's a really easy metaphor to think about. And also emojis and pages, that's pretty brilliant as well. And I feel like it's such, like emojis, as we know, are just like, you can convey so much. So I'm really glad you shared that. So one question that came in that I wanted to ask were about early check-ins and communications. So the question was around like, are early check-ins and communications with developers part of a defined process that you have, or are those kind of one-offs that were initiated by either you or the design team at large?
So it's been different for different teams. I will say with my team right now, we're working in an agile environment. We're working with shorter sprint schedules. So just the turnaround time for designs is really quick. So those reviews tend to be more ad hoc. Now with other teams with kind of longer sprint cycles, that established day of the week to review designs has been super helpful. So yeah, it's usually been one or the other, and it's been a defined part of the process for the team. It's super important to check in early.
Awesome, cool. We're going to try something interesting, and we're actually going to unmute some folks that have questions. So bear with me. But Julie, I know you had a question, so feel free and take it away.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. My question is, what do you do like at the beginning when a PM or engineer doesn't want to explore a certain direction because of the amount of work? How do you go about advocating to design for a better user experience than just like shipping something that is fast to build? And then also, what kind of framework do you use to decide those trade-offs between like engineering work and like designing for ultimately like a good user experience or a better user experience?
Sure, those are great questions. I've definitely been there. For your first one about how to navigate those negotiations with different partners on your team, that's where it's really, really important to find allies in your stakeholders, in your team members who can help you make a case for your vision. So some helpful people are your research partner, so you can do some quick evaluative tests on whatever you've designed. That often goes a long way. Data science can be a great partner. Maybe there are other A/B tests in your organization that weren't quite the same, but could help make a case for exploring what you want to explore. And then also engineers, I have most of my engineers, I'd say, through working together have come to be really product minded. And so they have a lot of great ideas and a lot of creativity. And at the end of the day, what they're working on, they want it to fulfill a user need. So by finding a couple of kind of key allies there so you can talk through ideas with, maybe they can help you think of things, think of ways to test it in a cheaper way. That's going to be your way through it, is finding the people to get to the solution that you want. Yeah, because I find that if I just try and think of something myself, it'll either take a really long time or I just can't do it. So definitely lean on your teammates for that. And then for your second question on what sort of framework to use to decide what to prioritize. So what comes to mind and what we've been using a lot on our teams is just this notion of de-risking a project. So if you have something on a scale of one project being a small A/B test and another project being a really long, fully fledged feature, usually what you want to do is find the smallest way to test something, just so you don't jump into building the really big thing. And what you're doing there is de-risking the time and effort of all of your teammates in order to get to that place. So for me, what my guiding light is making sure to talk to my different teammates to make sure that what we're testing is the smallest possible thing to get at the solution we want. And that usually works out.
Cool, thank you. And Julie for asking that question. I'm going to pop in a few other folks. I know Hernan had a question that's more general, so Helena would also love to hear from you. Take it away, Hernan. if we can figure this out. Okay, we'll ask a question while he's getting geared up. Let's see. Oh, what has the process been like for reviewing designs? Like, do you do screenshots and go through the Figma files, or is it more of a structured system that both of you are using?
It depends on the team that I've been working with. I will say that when I've used the dedicated day of the week to review designs, those kind of fell into, because it was at a regular cadence, the meetings kind of had the same flow. So we would open up with kind of walking through the entire flow and then saving questions for the end. I also found that by doing that, instead of kind of stopping in between to answer questions, it usually gives developers a better context for what the problem is that you're solving before potentially getting stuck in any rabbit holes in between. And then same for the ad hoc sessions. They usually follow the same rhythm of looking over the whole flow and then taking comments and questions from there. And what's also nice about Figma is that it's a good place to contain all of that feedback. So I found that some engineers are really good about giving feedback in the moment and kind of saying whatever comes across their mind, but then other engineers like to take their time with it and dig into the designs and kind of be able to process it on their own time. So those engineers who leave comments, then I have to work in that feedback outside of that meeting.
Awesome.
I love that so much. So I want to share maybe just one last question and would love to have both of your takes on it if you don't mind. Something that I'm always really curious about is just kind of evaluating and seeing how a design system kind of affects, whether positive or negative, kind of the collaboration between designers and developers. And if you all have seen a change there, if the design system was really like kind of a key driver of that change, or yeah, just any feedback in general of what that kind of looks like and maybe how it's worked for each of your teams.
Sure, I can jump in with this just because this is so top of mind for us. What we found is that a design system documentation is never going to be complete. There's always things being put in the system, taken out, updated. And so what we really need to do, and it's kind of a co-owned thing, is to make sure that what's documented is as much as possible a one-to-one representation of what's actually available as a reusable component. Because there are plenty of times where for a design system, say we're doodling on a component, it's this really cool thing, but it hasn't been user tested, it hasn't been built out. And so making sure that within Figma, we communicate to everybody else out that this is work in progress, it's not actually available, you can still use it as a component, but if your team is using it, then you're taking on the responsibility of building that out. So just being super transparent with communication.
Yeah, for us, we are a design team of 6 people at the moment, and way more engineers. So having those components built out in Figma is huge for us because it allows us to design really quickly. And like I said, at Coda, we are designing kind of in high fidelity most of the time. We're not really doing wireframes as much. So the components that we have in Figma, for the most part, are the ones that are live. And so most of the time we're just using the, unless we're designing a new feature, like, a new text component or that. And then it's quite clear that like we're changing this. But for the most part, having that is awesome. And I usually let my engineers know, like, hey, if there's like a slight variation in the file, like that's my bug and don't pay attention to that. Just use the component as it is in the code.
Amazing. Those were both really great answers. And honestly, I just want to thank you both so much again. That seems like maybe a really good place to wrap it up. So thank you for joining. Thanks for sharing all of that knowledge with all of us. I do want to thank everyone who also joined today. Just a reminder, we'll be sharing this stream as well as the decks that they both prepared out after. So you'll definitely have those as resources. Again, just want to thank you both for kind of the time and energy and coming on today. It was super fun to talk with you and to share all of that. We are doing these weekly. If you have any topic suggestions, definitely tweet at us, let us know. And you can always go to figma.com/events to see everything that's happening. But most of all, just want to remind everyone to be safe and hope everyone stays well. And it's just really great to see so much of the community here today. So thanks for joining Azra and I.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Talk to you later.